In this chapter, we're going to be talking about ethics and social responsibility. First, we're going to look at individual ethics. We will be defining ethics as an individual's personal beliefs regarding what is right and wrong or good and bad. It is very individual. What you think is unethical in a given situation might not be the same things that I think are unethical. Just as you can imagine that your parents' ethics and yours might not always align. When we think about ethical behavior, it's referred to sometimes as the eye of the beholder because it is so individual to each person. So it's what you think is okay. But it tends to be behavior that conforms to some generally accepted social norms. As a non-business related ethical example, we can look back, a bunch of years, 50, 100 years, and the idea of someone living and not being married, living with someone outside of marriage would have been considered unethical. But we know today that this is commonplace. Divorce would have been thought of as unethical and maybe frowned upon even based on your religion. But norms and societal norms change over time. So that doesn't have to do with necessarily with business, but it's an example where we can see how over time social norms change. So some examples of unethical behavior in the workplace. Borrowing office supplies, those are the ones that you have no intention of bringing back. You're not really borrowing them. Surfing the net, or I know that's an old phrase, being online all the time while you're at work when you're supposed to be working. So if we go back to the theories we learned about management, when you're at work under administrative theory, you should be doing work, not personal things. And much more serious than those two is filing falsified reports or inflated business expense reports. So if you're unfamiliar with what that is, when you're working for a company and maybe there's a conference you need to attend or you have to take a client out for lunch, those are business expenses and you can typically file a report to be reimbursed for them. So you file a report, and if you inflate the amount that was spent, or here at the college, we have a policy where if it's a food-related thing, alcohol cannot be reimbursed. So say the bill includes alcohol and you don't carve it out, that would be unethical. That would be a falsified report. And typically, that usually ends in termination. In most companies, you don't want to get caught doing that. All right, so those are just some examples, but there's so many more. If we talk about examples, claiming, taking credit for someone else's work, someone compliments, oh, you did such a great job on that project, but it was someone else's work and you don't acknowledge that it was their work. That's unethical, right? Give credit where credit is due. I'm sure we can think of many examples. So where do our ethics come from? Basically, your ethics come from everything you've experienced through your life, right? Your family, your peers, your experiences, the values and morals that you were brought up with all shape your current ethics. That's why your parents always worry about who you're hanging out with, because your peers can have an immense impact on your ethics. I always tell the story of, I remember taking my mom and my daughter to get ice cream. It was like a Baskin Robbins free scoop day. And it was the tiniest scoop of ice cream on a cone I had ever seen. And I mean, it was probably fine for my daughter. She was probably 3. And I joked to my mother that, well, if we want more, I guess we can just hit the Baskin Robbins in the next town. And the look I got from her, I was joking, kind of. But she was like, what are you teaching your daughter? And she was right. She put me in check. Like, yeah, there are things you can do that are unethical, but legal. I mean, that's totally legal, right? The Baskin-Robbins is offering a promotion. I could conceivably go to every one and get my free cone. But is it ethical? No, it's not. Baskin-Robbins is trying to build up business and offering this token ice cream and hoping you'll buy more. Things can be ethical and legal. Things can be unethical and illegal. And then we can have these other combinations. Something can be legal but unethical, illegal but ethical. So I want you to try and think of some examples in those different categories. Now let's talk about managerial ethics. These are the standards of behavior that guide individual managers in their work. We're going to look at three basic areas of concern for managerial ethics, which are the relationship of the firm to the employee. So we can see the arrow saying, so the firm or the organization, how it treats its employees. And some of those issues are they fair in the hiring and firing process? Are wages and working conditions fair? And do they provide privacy and respect for employees? Another area of ethics in the workplace is, how do the employees treat the organization? So these are things like conflicts of interest. So are you honest and upfront with the organization? Secrecy and confidentiality. You shouldn't be sharing business, things that are supposed to be kept within the business outside of the business. And are you conducting yourself in an honest way and with integrity? The third thing to be concerned with is how employees and the organization treat economic agents. These would be your customers, competitors, stockholders, suppliers, dealers, and the unions. In the middle, we can see the green box that shows some areas that could be subject to ethical ambiguities that would affect our economic agents. So managers need to approach each relationship from an ethical and moral perspective, really questioning and thinking about this with intention. Simply put, you have your individual employees' values, the organization has values, and that's where we're going to see the managerial values. It is important to really think about the message you send, that you might want to have a code of conduct, have meetings where you talk about ethics, what's acceptable, what's unacceptable, and walk the walk. You can't expect your employees to behave ethically if the bosses are not. If the boss comes in late, leaves early, fudges numbers, isn't honest, then you can't expect that your employees are going to behave any differently. It is very important to lead by example. So if we set a policy that guides behavior, that we want our employees to behave in an ethical way with customers, suppliers, etc., and we have a salesperson that is not doing that, we can't excuse the behavior just because he's one of our best salespeople. That's not okay. It needs to be impersonal and it needs to be fair to everyone. If we make an exception because someone is, our top salesperson, you're setting a horrible example, and don't be surprised that you start to see the ethics slide. That I'm not a fan of terminating someone immediately. I think anytime you see that someone is doing something wrong, you give them the opportunity to fix it, improve. Of course, if it's illegal or a huge violation, then yeah, you have to terminate them. But you give this person a chance, and if they don't fix their behavior, they do need to be terminated. And I think your actions need to be swift to send a message to everyone in the organization that this is unacceptable. Now we'll switch gears and talk about social responsibility. When we talk about ethics, we're talking about individuals. Individuals have ethics. When we talk about social responsibility, we're referring to what organizations do. So the book defines social responsibility as the set of obligations an organization has to protect and enhance the societal context in which it functions. So traditionally, when we think about businesses, we think about someone starting a business, taking on the risk, putting in their capital, and trying to make a profit. If we have several owners or stockholders in our company, we're working to increase profits for our owners. Those might be referred to as your stockholders. But with social responsibility, we take a much broader stakeholder approach when we look at an organization. So stakeholders are not just owners. Owners are stakeholders, but they are people and organizations that are directly affected by the behaviors of an organization and that have a stake in its performance. And the next slide will go through some examples of stakeholders. But with social responsibility, we have three areas here. We worry about our stakeholders, not just our stockholders. We are concerned with the natural environment and also general social welfare. So with social responsibility, the literature sometimes talks about the triple bottom line. So when we say the bottom line, that usually means profits. But with social responsibility, we have a triple bottom line. We will be looking at our economic performance as well as our social and environmental performance. Here are some examples of organizational stakeholders. So we still have our owners and investors. And another word for this is going to be stockholders if it's a public company that has shares of stock. But as we can see, these could potentially be other people or organizations that have a stake or are affected by our organization. So I always give an example of Walmart. If Walmart was going to move into your town, who has a stake in this, right? The local government would have a stake because they're going to be getting tax revenues. Customers, obviously. The local community is definitely affected. Think about a Walmart moving into your town. It is going to bring a lot of people into that area. Are they just moving in and opening business, or are they going to make sure that the roads can handle what's the new traffic that's going to be coming in, the noise, being open late, keeping it neat? So there are a lot of people, not just customers, not just owners, but also the local community. They'll be hiring people, so it could be a good thing for the community, offering more jobs. So with social responsibility, we look at our stakeholders and we think about who we are impacting and in the course of doing business and trying to behave in a socially responsible way. So there are arguments for and against being socially responsible, and let's take a look at that. I would hope so far into this chapter, you would think that social responsibility is a good thing. And here on the left are the arguments for social responsibility. Business creates problems and therefore should help solve them. Corporations are citizens in our society. Businesses have the resources to help solve a lot of our problems, our societal problems, and business is a partner in our society along with the government and the general population. So they should be helping with these issues. However, there are people who argue against social responsibility. And one of them is, or was, Milton Friedman. He was an American economist who believed that the only social responsibility a business has is to its owners. That's a very classic view of business. You are there to make money for your owners and your investors, your stockholders, and that's it. Pay your taxes, follow all the laws. So the arguments against social responsibility are that the purpose of business in the United States is to generate profit for owners, and that is, you'll see, what we call the defensive stance to social responsibility. If businesses are involved in social programs, it gives them too much power. Okay, there's conflicts of interest that can happen if a business is doing these things, and businesses lack the expertise to manage social programs. There's a great movie, it's The Corporation, and someone in it says that, what business is it of the head of General Motors to decide the acceptable level of emissions. We're not relying on them for that. That's the government's job, right? So those are arguments against social responsibility. Now we're going to look at different approaches businesses, organizations can take to social responsibility. So we're going to look at it as a spectrum where at this end, it's the lowest amount of social responsibility being shown, or the lack of social responsibility. And at this end is the highest amount of social responsibility. You might notice that it can be very hard to clearly define an organization into one of these four stances, because sometimes a business can be very socially responsible in one area. Perhaps they're great to their employees, but they're not good to the environment. So it's a hard thing to categorize businesses this way, but I want to make sure we understand it because you will be tested on it. So down here on this end is the lowest level of social responsibility. They do as little as possible to solve social or environmental problems, and when they do cross the ethical or legal line, they tend to deny any wrongdoing. So sometimes at this end, they don't even meet the minimum standard of following the law. A good example here would be Enron. They took an obstructionist stance to social responsibility. They created false power shortages and fudged the numbers internally. They put a lot of financial burden on many investors and created issues with many of the people who would lose power. As we move here to the defensive stance, in the defensive stance, businesses, organizations follow all laws but do nothing more. Milton Friedman, an American economist, talks briefly about social responsibility in the movie The Corporation. He advocates for a defensive stance. He believes a company is being socially responsible when they provide jobs, provide products that consumers want, pay their taxes, and follow the laws. In his view, when they go beyond that, they're taking profits away from their stockholders. He feels it is the government's job to determine what is required regarding things like emissions, etc. However, today, we see that companies can do more than the minimum, and it not only benefits the environment, it benefits the owners by being cost-effective as well. Additionally, research has shown that social responsibility has an indirect impact on the firm's bottom line through improvement in that firm's reputation. A good reputation can benefit the firm by making it more attractive to investors, customers, and also applicants. Next, we have the accommodative stance. This involves following all laws and going beyond that minimum. Usually it means being responsive to requests. For instance, if your business isn't already offering work from home or flex time or anything that has become kind of popular to attract employees to work at your business, and one of your employees is requesting that HR come up with a new policy that allows for that, if they agree to do that and it's good for their employees, then that's the accommodative stance. They will do things that are socially responsible, but they need to be asked to do them. The book talks about asking for support for, say, Little League, like going to the organization and saying, hey, will you donate to our nonprofit and help us out? And they might do that. Well, that's an accommodative stance because they had to be asked to do it. When we go to the last stage, which is the the highest level of social responsibility, what we see here is that the organization is actually proactive and seeking out ways to be socially responsible. So you don't have to ask them, they've already thought of things they can do. Patagonia is a great example of a company that has always been very proactive. They were doing things that were good for the environment before people were even thinking that way. They also had policies for their workers that allowed them to have a lot of freedom in the workplace, which gave them work-life balance. There's a lot of companies out there that are doing things that go above and beyond, and that highest level, we call it the proactive stance to social responsibility. As I said before, it can be difficult to neatly put companies into a category. They may do good things in some areas and not in others. An important element of social responsibility is the relationship between business and government. As we can see on this slide, We can see how the government influences business and how business can have an impact on the government. Now, we saw back in Chapter 3 that environments are very important and that businesses might react to things happening outside their business through these different ways to influence the government. We talked about lobbying. The government tries to influence businesses to be more socially responsible, primarily through direct means like legislation. As you can see here, having environmental protections in place, consumer protections in place, they can influence the social responsibility of business by making something legal or illegal. But they can also have an indirect impact through things like tax codes. So if a business can get a tax break by donating to charities or donating products, that will influence their social responsibility as well. We're going to wrap up this chapter by talking about how we manage social responsibility. Here are some formal organizational dimensions for managing social responsibility. First, we're going to talk about legal compliance. This is the extent to which the organization conforms to local, state, federal, and international laws. The task of managing legal compliance is generally assigned to managers in different functional areas of the organization. For example, the top human resource person is going to be responsible for making sure they're in compliance with regulations concerning hiring, pay, and workplace safety and health. Just like the top financial executive is going to oversee compliance with securities and banking regulations. Next, we have ethical compliance. This is the extent to which members of the organization follow basic ethical legal standards of behavior. An organization might establish code of conduct, provide training so that employees are trained on what is expected of them in the organization and the code of conduct. It's important for your employees to understand what a conflict of interest is, and that can be part of training. They might also put together an ethics committee that can serve to evaluate alleged ethical misconduct by their employees. And lastly, we have philanthropic giving. This is when we award funds or gifts to charities and other social programs. So it might be that a computer company donates their computers to school districts, or part of your sales is earmarked for a donation to certain causes. Now we're going to look at the informal organizational dimensions to managing social responsibility. We've talked about this before. Your leaders in the organization need to behave ethically and set the tone, and that culture can be developed through leadership practices and the policies that are put in place that can really define the ethics of an organization. Whistleblowing. Let's first define it. Whistleblowing is the disclosure by an employee of illegal or unethical conduct on the part of others within the organization. This might be brought to the attention of upper management or supervisors, or, sometimes we refer to whistleblowing as when someone in the organization reports it to the media to make it public. How the organization responds to this disclosure by an employee is going to be it's going to indicate how they feel about social responsibility. So Enron, there was a whistleblower that tried to tell the organization what was going on, and they listened, but they did nothing about it. So it was very clear that they weren't worried about it. They were more worried with profits. So I want to make sure you understand what whistleblowing is. And there are laws out there that protect whistleblowers, but if a firm is trying to hide something, probably the first response you see is that that employee gets terminated. But then there are laws that, an employee that has been terminated because they were trying to disclose this illegal or unethical conduct can seek damages from the organization for being terminated. Lastly, let's look at the concept of control. And when we talk about control, we're talking about the function of control, monitoring how we're doing. So we're evaluating how we respond to questionable legal or ethical conduct. So I kind of talked about this earlier. If we see something that's wrong, is there an immediate follow-up to those to respond to those events? My example was about a salesperson that's not following either legal or ethical standards. And if they're really good at their job, do we kind of give them a pass? Or do we take action? We are setting the tone for the rest of the organization. Next, we have a corporate social audit. All right, so a social audit is not just looking at the numbers, it's looking at how we're doing in terms of our social responsibility. So we analyze the effectiveness of our social performance, and we should clearly define what our social goals are, analyze our resources, and determine how well those goals are being met, and make recommendations for areas needing attention. So in the financial area of our business, we do audits, especially if we're a public company. Our books will need to be audited. So that's where they're checking our numbers. A social audit is where we're looking at our social goals and seeing if we're meeting that.